Dave's just call us U-Hauls. We had a north and south of the gangs, the U-Hauls.
Well, they're about 10 minutes late on that clock.
This is recorded.
You can't have one at a time.
Oh, you are good.
That was just in case they were seeing me.
The other thing that came out of, I picked it up, you know, and this
Oh,
time,
yeah.
so I dropped that.
Washington.
Thanks. Thank you all for joining us. This is an exciting time, an exciting project at the Kennedy School as we explore Chads and Dimples and butterfly ballots. The country is watching the election process in Florida, and it's exposed problems throughout the country. As you know, elections are run at the local level, not at the national level, and there's great concern about the integrity of the voting system. We're at a moment in history when things will change. The next president will have a mandate, and certainly the members of Congress believe they have a mandate to tell local election officials what to do. But we want you to learn tonight from a few local election officials and from a Secretary of State, Sharon Priest. It's a momentous moment. I'll introduce our panel in just a few moments. But did any of you know 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years ago, just how fragile the election system sometimes appears to be? In New York City, voters use metal lever action machines that are so old, each has 27,000 parts. And in Louisiana, machines are vulnerable to be rigged with pliers and a screwdriver or a cigarette lighter or a Q-tip. Louisiana's former election commissioner, Jerry Fowler, pleaded guilty 14 days ago to a kickback scheme with a voting machine dealer. The national voting system is so troubled that the National Bureau of Standards, a federal agency now known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, said 12 years ago that election mainstays, punch card ballots, should be junked, yet over 500 counties still use punch card ballots. It's a tremendously complicated system. The federal government gives, through the Constitution, much authority to the state and local governments for handling elections. But they're very complicated. There are 3,043 counties in America. There are, depending on who's counting, over 200,000 election precincts in America. And it's going to take a lot of money to fix the system. We have the best people you can find tonight to hear about election mechanics. Welcome please from Arkansas, Secretary of State Sharon Priest. I'd like you also to...
Good evening.
I'd like to also welcome immediately to my left Doug Lewis, the Director of the Election Center, which is part of the National Association of State Election Directors. Trevor Potter from Wiley, Ryan and Fielding is well known and recognized as the country's leading expert on election law. He's also the past chairman of the Federal Election Commission. We have Donald Tye, who is director of YouthEvote.net is at the center of testing for internet voting and oversaw a project in which 1.3 million young children voted over the internet. And we have Richard Sudriet, President of the International Foundation for Election Systems. Welcome to all of you here, all of you joining us on the internet. And let's turn first now to Secretary of State Sharon Priest.
Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here, if it is by video conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it into Boston today. However, I'm not unfamiliar with the forum, as I was fortunate enough to spend 3 weeks there for a summer program and have a broken arm to prove it. So I appreciate the time that I did spend there. I'd like to commend the Kennedy School for their involvement in this elections process. The Kennedy School has a great reputation in terms of governmental issues, governmental affairs, and I think they are an appropriate place that we have this discussion tonight, and hopefully we'll continue to have these discussions. I think this has been a very unique and interesting time in our country. We have had an opportunity to deal with a real-life civics education, one that I'm not sure we'll have an opportunity to see again, probably not in my lifetime and maybe not in my children's lifetime. But I think, as Doug Lewis says, we are looking not for a revolution in election law, but an evolution. And the National Association of Secretaries of State, along with the Election Center and Doug Lewis, the NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, we've put together a task force so we can take a comprehensive look at elections issues from the national, state, and local levels, and so that we're not reacting in a knee-jerk way to what's happening in Florida. And I'm not so certain that we collectively don't have the answers now through best practices. Clearly we have work to do, and there's other things that we can be looking at and should be looking at. But I think through a reflective process and a determined process, we can make some changes in elections in our country.
Thank you. Let's move to Doug Lewis, who has a good view of the local election system. This is director of the Election Center, which is part of the National Association of State Election Directors. Fill our heads with facts and figures so we can get up to speed on just how complicated the system can be and what we can do to solve these problems we're seeing in Florida and now throughout the country.
Okay. First, let me say the Election Center is a freestanding organization. We actually gave birth to the National Association of State Election Directors, and they are both separate institutions. We work very closely with them in regulating voting equipment. Not regulating, that's not true, testing voting equipment. Some of the figures that might interest those of you here at how complicated this process can be is we have roughly 200,000 precincts in America. We have roughly 100 million voters. We have roughly 1 million poll workers involved on election day, and no other office in government ever has to recruit that kind of workforce that's sometimes ill-trained. We have roughly somewhere between 15 and 20,000 elections administrators in the country. And so the process as it works in America was designed to be inefficient. As opposed to all other democracies in the world which are organized from the top down, ours has historically been organized from the bottom up. And it's because the framers of the Constitution, quite frankly, distrusted putting election authority into a centralized authority. And so that affected the way we ran elections all along. And up until this election, I would say that most of us have thought that the election process has worked extraordinarily well. What we didn't see probably is all the warts that come with the system. And for elections administrators, let me say to you, the perfect election is the election in which none of our mistakes get made public. I know of no election official in America that has ever run a perfect election unless it only involved one or two voters. And even then somebody probably complained. And so where we are in this situation is that we have been, as a result of this particular election and as a result of the particular focus on Florida, we have become convinced that there's something terribly wrong with the process. And I will say to you that I think there are some things, obviously, that are going to have to be looked at. And the things that we have all learned is that elections look simple, but are entirely complex. And that has only become apparent in this process. Certainly, we need to look at something about ballot design. I think we're going to have to face up to the fact that in some cases not all voters can interpret the same kinds of things, and we're going to need to look at how voters view and look at ballots, and so we're going to have to do something about that. We're obviously going to have to look at voting equipment and do a review as to what is fact and what is fiction as a result of this election. We're going to look at Chad, and we all learned something about Chad, hanging and otherwise. By the way, I think one of the things we all do is go to Florida and sweep up all the Chad, and whoever gets named president out of all this process, we ought to have the Chad parade. We've learned something about Dimples. We've learned something about what imprecision in law as to what constitutes a vote creates. We've learned something about what imprecision in law about handling recounts creates. We've certainly learned about voter error, and in fact, we've discovered some things that we didn't really heretofore know, is that some voters tend to make higher numbers of mistakes depending on where they live and what their economic background is, and certainly we're going to have to look at that and what we need to do in terms of voter education. And certainly we've learned that we need to, all of us, pay attention to the process itself. But let me leave you with this thought before we get on to the rest of the subject matter. The election process in America has worked exceedingly well for 200 years. And the result of this election should not so alarm us that we lose faith in the process, because the process does work. It is flawed, and it needs some fixing. But as Sharon said, in quoting what I've said before, this is about evolution, not revolution. And hopefully that's where we'll be. Well, I'm kind of like the two fellows at the same party. One of them said, "Boy, this dull party." He said, "I believe I'm going to leave." The other fellow said, "That ought to help some."
Well, for folks who are close to this, as you've been for a long time, it doesn't seem like there's a crisis, but most people who haven't been paying attention, it feels like a crisis to them. And members of Congress are calling for reform. There are calls to privatize the entire system. There will be initiative, a referendum, trying to put this on state ballots to try and move, for example, to internet voting. There will be some kind of a federal role, and along with a federal role, I hope that there is some federal money, because it's exceptionally expensive to replace the voting machines when you're looking at over 200,000 voting precincts. Turning to the federal role and election law, Trevor Potter.
Thank you. I think one of the places to start is to note that traditionally there hasn't been a federal role, so that part of the discussion tonight is revolutionary simply in talking about the possibility that we may see some sort of federal standards or minimums, some sort of federal funding. I think historically, as Doug noted, this has been elections have been something run locally. That's partly because of our federal structure. What's happened over the last maybe 40 or 50 years is that the country has changed significantly. And I think you can make the argument that the voting systems haven't adapted themselves to all of those changes. We know and have learned a lot about the age of some of the technology being used, but there are other changes. We've had significant changes since the Voting Rights Act in the population of voters. Florida is in many ways a probably stronger example than much of the rest of the country in terms of differences with languages, differences with educational background, differences with comfort levels with voting. We hear a lot about first-time voters being puzzled by how all this worked. We're a more mobile country, so that has led to less familiarity with the local voting process. It's led to greater use of absentee ballots. We're less community-oriented, and that affects election administrators because it's harder to get volunteers, it's harder for the parties to get poll watchers. If you look at the picture we have in Florida, I think it's important to remember that it's not just the tabulation of the vote that we should be focusing on. You can start with voter registration, the system we have that requires in all but a few states registration well in advance of voting days, the attempts that were made by Congress a couple years ago to make it easier to register through motor voter, and some of the problems that's caused where you've set up these parallel systems of registration. You can either register traditionally at the local county office, or you can register by going to the Department of Motor Vehicles or to a government agency with benefits. And what we've discovered in this election is that we haven't yet found a way to marry those two systems so that people register at DMV and then they discover that their name is not on the motor voter list, that many states don't have an accurate statewide registry of voters that's available by computer at the local voting places. So voting registration is inexact and cumbersome. The absentee ballot process has been a problem in terms of, as we saw in Florida, the difficulty of getting the applications exactly right, of balancing security versus ease of access, of getting the votes in and counted. The fact that we waited for 10 days for the overseas ballots, I think, raises some issues. Then voting itself, as we know, was in some cases confusing or slow with long lines, plus the difficulties with butterflies and other types of ballots. And then we all are familiar with the tabulation issues. Where does this go on the federal level? I think there are going to be a couple federal questions. One is, should there be some sort of a federal minimum technological standard, at least for federal elections? Congress does not have the authority to regulate technology or standards for state and local elections. It does, under the Constitution, have the ability to set the time, place, and manner of elections for the House and Senate. So that's the hook that Congress could use if it wanted to get into this. I think my own sense is it would be a mistake to come up with any sort of a single nationwide answer, but that doesn't mean that you can't set error ratios and demand that states use technology that is going to produce a acceptably low rate of error in voting tabulation or in ease of voting. I think the other issue that the federal government will be looking at is the question of the ballot design. Again, is the ballot something that is voter friendly, something that's easy for people to use and ideally difficult for them to get wrong? So you'll see those. The federal government is already involved in the internet in the sense that the Department of Defense conducted a pilot study this year about the questioning whether it be possible to use the internet for military voting overseas. I think you could see a secure defense system being used for internet voting for people in the armed services, raises the question of whether you couldn't do something like that for other overseas voters. And finally, as you suggested, I think you're going to see demands by the states that there be some federal money, particularly if there are going to be federal demands that the system be improved. One of the big issues we found in Florida is that voting technology depended a lot on local resources. And I don't think Americans understood that one county might be using a outdated piece of machinery because it only cost $150 and somebody else could afford a multi-$1,000 electronic machine. And that's something I think that you're going to see Congress really looking at is, are we establishing a new type of poll tax by making it harder for some people to vote than others?
Before we move on to Donald Ty, I'd like to go back to Secretary of State Sharon Priest from Arkansas. Are you worried about or enthusiastic about federal intervention in this area? What would you like them to do, or do you just want them to stay away?
Well, I think the secretaries generally are a little concerned about having federal elections, having federal government involved in this process. That said, I also think we're a little bit concerned about unfunded mandates. We've seen those. My background was in city government before I became Secretary of State, and we've seen a lot of unfunded mandates over the years. Election equipment is expensive, and as Trevor pointed out, we have found out through this process that not only are all politics local, as Tip O'Neill said, but all elections are too. And there is no one-size-fits-all answer for this. Even within our states, you have counties that can do some things, have more resources available to them, and others that don't. So in Arkansas, we have everything from Optiscan to paper ballots that are hand counted. And that's not unusual across the country. So I think when we're looking for answers, we need to look within our states first and then nationally. And I think that Congress needs to trust us a little bit more to find the solution. We take a great deal of pride in the elections process in our states and in our counties. And I think if they'll give us a little bit of time to look at this comprehensively and not everybody try to jump in with a solution, I think we'll find it.
One of the solutions that many people are pointing to very quickly is the internet. We know that there was a trial vote, for example, in Iowa, in California, and I'd like to turn now to Donald Ty to tell us about the 1.3 million students who voted through youthevote.net, and more generally what the prospects look like for internet voting.
Well, to pick up quickly on a point that Secretary Priest made, I think any of us looking ahead to the decision-making process that will occur following Florida and this count is that the solutions will remain local and locally applied. And so certainly any thoughts I would have about internet voting are not that it is the answer to what our current local structure of voting is, but probably will be an answer. And so that's one of the perspectives that this project did got started with. It was a project of a 501c3, a nonpartisan, nonprofit voter education site called freedomchannel.com, utilizing technology to give unfiltered information, access to voters. It was a lot of digital video of direct candidate to camera on for offices from president to Senate to House and governor throughout the country, as well as having versions in just audio and then the transcript available so that people with every modem speed could access the information equally. With that being aimed at voters, Youth eVote was a project to engage young Americans, optimistically we call them pre-voters, open to students K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, based through their schools. And as David King mentioned, 1.3 million students, close to 10,000 schools across the country, all 50 states voted. Not that it matters, but so that you're able to pay attention to anything else that gets said tonight. George W. Bush happened to win this 1.3 million student vote. Electoral College was 355 to 183. And of course, one of the aspects of the internet is we knew that at about 1 minute past, less than a minute past the closing of the polls. The goal of Youth eVote was to make today's students tomorrow's voters long-term, but short-term, and really the primary focus of the project was to increase the teaching and learning of civics. Other goals included hopefully to get more adults to the polls even this November 7th, because what parent wants to answer no to their child when he says, well, I got to vote for president, are you going to do it on next Tuesday? But also to give schools and localities a tool to generate funds or support in their local community to help resolve or address the digital divide. It was a fairly simple project, but it did require connectivity, and so we tried to work together on putting them together with sources that could help on that. The feedback that we've gotten from teachers who are looking for an opportunity to utilize technology incorporated into their curriculum has been very strong. And so we felt great about that up to about November 7th. And our focus since about 4 a.m., November 8th, if I recall my time on my couch correctly, the focus really has been on what maybe it could teach us about internet voting. And it's some important lessons. The most important thing about, well, a couple of important things about actual voting. Access to the ballot, understanding the ballots is crucial, and the integrity both of the votes once they've happened and your privacy when you're making the vote and afterwards are crucial. And there's probably some aspects of how most of us might be connected to the internet that don't offer that yet. But there might be options like, instead of remote internet voting, which would allow you to do it from a home or work or anywhere that you happen to be, it could start with polling place internet access or intranet access, where it would be a secure connection directly from that polling place to where the data is stored, ensuring its integrity and confirming its integrity, easily monitored, and what they call being able to closely audit the process, sort of like a recount where you'd reevaluate that every vote cast was counted without ever knowing who had voted in what way. My guess is that'll be some of the first steps that will be taken. A couple other poll numbers that we've watched as we've looked at its feasibility. One is that an ABC study had shown that the older Americans are less comfortable with technology. 60% of those 60 years and older said they'd have no interest in voting online. But 20% of 60-year-olds and older said they'd be comfortable with it, but 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they'd be comfortable with it. And when some of the numbers that we're battling are less than a third of 18 to 24-year-olds voting, and an incredibly high comfort level and, frankly, expectation level in the context of government providing service to citizens, my guess is those two will create a demand for internet voting. As a last quick thought, one of the reasons that we had wanted to focus on pre-voters, kids before they left high school, is because of that number of 32% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting in the last presidential election represents another downward step that has been a continual slide in participation. And this, while great efforts like Rock the Vote or MTV's Choose or Lose have been going on. So clearly there's a need to get them excited about voting like they might be about getting their first driver's license before they reach that age.
It's important for us all to remember that voting is a habit and non-voting is also a habit, and it's a habit learned early. And we most likely have lost much of the generation who is not voting to voting for many years. It'll take something like a crisis to bring them back to the polls. So the focus is right to focus on young people and get them excited about it even before they can vote. All of this costs a tremendous amount of money. When you think across the 200,000 plus precincts, to bring them up to speed and incorporate Americans with Disabilities Act, the estimates are $6 to $8 billion. That's very hard to raise at the county level, which is why the federal government will have to help out at some stage. This won't happen overnight, and it'll probably be incremental change, maybe first by getting rid of some of the poorly performing punch card machines. There are, as you may also know, many different kinds of punch card machines, some that work quite well and some that, as we can tell from Florida, don't. America's a laughing stock of much of the world by the way we've run this election. And we're getting our comeuppance now. There are other countries that run their elections much better than the United States, and to speak a little to this is Richard Sudriette from the International Foundation for Election Systems. What can we learn from the rest of the world?
First off, I want to thank David King and everybody here at the Institute of Politics And I'm also pleased to see my friend Mickey Edwards from Oklahoma, fellow Oklahoman here tonight. I'm not going to predict the winner of this election, but I will make one prediction. Judge Burton will be the Time Man of the Year. I would take issue with David's comments about the U.S. as a laughingstock. We all are conscious that the U.S. has played a leading role in the world in helping to promote democracy and free elections. My own organization, the International Foundation for Election Systems, IFAS, was established back in 1987 with the help of the U.S. Agency for International Development. We've worked in over 120 countries around the world in helping promote democracy and free and fair elections. But the reason why I take issue with your point is that in spite of all this, we hosted over 40 delegations of visiting election officials from around the world, and I continue to hear back from them. And in spite of, there is a degree of amusement with regard to the dimple chads and lots of different translations coming out. The French and Spanish are translating them as confetti. But I think the point that I keep hearing is that our system is working. We're working it out through our courts, we're working it out through our system, and at the end of the day, in spite of all of the fever pitch surrounding the immediacy of the crisis, we will get through this, we will solve it, we will have a president, we will have our institutions. The challenge, I think, not only for us, but the rest of the world, is not to view this as a crisis. As Doug Lewis said, I mean, we're tending to focus on the glass being half empty. And in reality, we need to look at the glass being half full. In 95% of the jurisdictions, elections went very well. So we do see, though, that there are major problems. And the good that comes out of this whole election is, first, the whole field of election administration is getting the notice and the attention that it rightfully deserves. Our organization from the beginning has worked throughout the world promoting the concept of process over individual elections, putting process and institutions in place that function, that are transparent, that are professional. And I think it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that even though people have problems with, in Florida, for example, with the dimple chads, on the whole, election administrators across the United States have done a very good job. And our challenge here today, and the challenge I think put forward to us by the Institute of Politics, is how do we take the opportunity and come up with some recommendations and changes to address those glaring problems that did arise during this election process. So one of the issues, obviously, people are constantly talking about election technology. The technology is the silver bullet in all this. And I think that's the message out of all this, is there is no one single solution. In order for us to move, to learn from this election and move forward, we have to look at all different elements of the election process. Training of election officials. We have to look at technology, but technology as a tool. It's not an end of itself. I mean, in the work that we've done in many countries around the world, we know that if you don't have a solid administration system in place, well-trained people who are professional and know what they're doing, in some ways technology can be even more of a nightmare, because instead of helping make things clearer, it can make it even more difficult. The other issue that I think that we need to do is stand back and look at the experiences of other countries. One of the figures that has been mentioned here about the possibility of revamping election equipment in the U.S. could come up to a price tab of between $6 to $8 billion. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, But when you think of the overall impact of an election on the U.S., on our economy, on our position in the world, not to mention when you look at the investments that other countries around the world have made. Mexico recently inaugurated their president. They held the most honest, open election in that country's history. Well, this was a process that started back in 1994, and one of the first steps was they invested $1 billion in a national ID card. I'm not advocating an ID card, I'm just using this as an example. They made an investment on an element that they felt was critical to helping instill the faith of the voters of Mexico in the process. And we can see in the end it paid off. They had a model election, and the president has now been installed. So in terms of standardization of election technology, I think that we need to remember that in the United States we have a tradition of local control and local involvement. We can't just throw that out. Yes, I think there can be a menu of options, and I think that's one of the benefits of this project, is providing not only Congress but also other decision makers around the U.S. the different things that could be done. But at the same time, I think it's a mistake to think that there is a silver bullet, that there is a model that we need to follow. So I think that the U.S. can be very proud of the record that we've had in helping promote democracy around the world. I think in spite of the difficulties in this recent election, we still should be very proud of our system. And above all else, the next time you hear somebody say, "My vote doesn't count," you know that is a bunch of bunk. I mean, this election, if it did nothing more, it drove home the point that every citizen has a responsibility to participate in this great system and make sure that democracy endures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to you and your questions. We'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. Approach the microphones on the first floor, and please tell us who you are, where you're from, ask a brief question, and if you'd like to address any of the members of the panel specifically, go right ahead. Thank you.
I'm an alumni from Harvard University, and I would like to address my question to Professor King. Okay. First, I want to thank the panel for enlightening us, about this issue. And Professor King, you said that America is a laughingstock by much of the world by the way we are running this election. And I want to know something about, what about the ballots that weren't counted? Now, just want to say something over here. Some lawyers want lots of money. Some lawyers want name recognition, and some lawyers want to be immortalized in history. Barry Richards, a Bush attorney who is a Democrat, battled the Democrats in the Florida Supreme Court. You can argue that maybe he believes in the principle of this particular case. But when newspaper headlines say, "Enough already, quit this game," what about the ballots that weren't counted? I wonder if the citizens of this country have become scapegoats. And my question to you, Professor, has two parts. Why would a Democrat fight against his own party? And why would Bush hire a Democrat in the first place?
I can't speak to why a Democrat would be doing what in Florida or why a Republican would hire one. But there is an interesting problem as to what counts as a vote. And it turns on the issue that Mr. Lewis discussed earlier. There are ambiguities about what constitutes a vote and how they should be challenged. And there needs to be a better sense of best practices on this. Mr. Lewis, do you have a response?
The specific question that you ask, I have no answer for. Other than to say some of my friends are for Bush and some of my friends are for Gore, and I'm with my friends. In terms of what constitutes a vote, when an election administrator counts a vote, it has to be when a voter has made voter error or has voted in a way that the system did not anticipate and could not handle. And these are usually only paper-based systems. We then have to sit down and try to determine voter intent. And for elections administrators to do that and to be fair, they look at these people as the referees of the system. To be fair, they have to have clear intent as to what the voter meant to do. Unfortunately, what happened in Florida appears to be a lack of imprecision in terms of defining what constitutes a vote. Washington State and California, who use these punch card systems, have a much, much clearer definition of what is a vote and what is not a vote in a situation such as this. That imprecision in their own state law created confusion, and certainly with each county determining on its own what would constitute a vote, it then became an unbalanced situation. Elections administrators, by their very nature, are going to try to be fair. It doesn't matter whether they got there as Republicans or they got there as Democrats. Once they become an election administrator, they become neutral. And anybody who starts out in the process thinking that they're going to be partisan quickly figures out that they have to be neutral because the system doesn't work otherwise. Now, when you get to a contest situation, lawyers for the side that are behind at that point will raise every doubt about every situation and will create as much doubt as possible. And what they're trying to influence is, quite frankly, not the public. They're trying to influence a judge before they ever get into court. And this imprecision in law of not defining what constitutes a vote, and then compounded by imprecision in law about how a recount is to be conducted. That is very specifically what you will do. Those two things combined created most of the problem that we're seeing today.
I'd like to turn to Trevor Potter before we go to the next question.
I have two answers for you. The first, going specifically to your question, I speak to as a lawyer, and that is that lawyers pride themselves on being able to take whatever case is offered to them and provide the best representation possible. Barry Richards is a well-known lawyer and advocate in Florida, and my guess is he took it as a Democrat because he thought the legal questions presented were important and that he could represent Bush. If you look at Mr. Boies, who took the role of representing the government in the Microsoft case, my assumption is that if Microsoft had offered to hire him instead, he's a professional and he would have looked at that representation. So I think one of the problems we have here is that the assumption is that everybody in Florida is, and in this whole system, is supposed to play a partisan role. And I think that's one of the dangers here is that the people who are in the middle and trying to do their best job professionally get drowned out by somebody who says, well, they're a Democrat, so they're being unfair, or they're a Republican, of course they would rule that way. And we, and I don't know if Richard wants to speak to this, but we have a somewhat different system than much of the world does, in that we don't have a independent, nonpartisan, out-of-politics group of people who are responsible for conducting our elections, as some countries do. Because it's so localized, you have people who are active in political activity who are then also the people on election day who are responsible for the system. Now, they're balanced by people from the other party who are looking over their shoulder, but they're not out of the fray. And I think that's something that makes it difficult when people are looking at Florida and saying, wait a minute, why are people who are Republicans or Democrats identified that way? Why are they the decision makers?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Edie Wilson. I live in Washington, D.C. I went to the Kennedy School, and I was born on Election Day. We lost. And I have a couple of specific questions for various people on the panel. For Trevor Potter, can we broaden this for a moment and get back to a larger debate that we've had from time to time in this country about Election Day? Isn't it true that the House of Representatives can change Election Day by a simple majority vote, one of the simpler votes that we have? And where are we in the discussion of moving to weekend voting, in your estimation? And then for Secretary Priest, due to a failure of the federal level to, shall we say, change Election Day, can you talk about what you think some of the states are doing to innovate on Election Day in terms of early voting and no-cause absentee ballots and some of the systems which I don't think a lot of people are aware of in other localities that are giving people an ability to vote before Election Day, because again, Election Day is fixed on this rather odd day in the middle of the week. For Mr. Lewis, two technologies that we haven't talked about that are lower grade technologies than the internet but apparently make a big difference in how elections are run are database technology, the ability to computerize election rolls, and digital signature technology. Could you comment on those, and could you tell us whether the voter rolls in the United States in these 200,000 counties that you mentioned, are they computerized yet? And then finally, for Richard Sudriat, my friend, my question is, what if they came, Richard? What if we had an election that people were really interested in and they really felt passionately, and let's say 5% or 7% more Americans came to the polls, given the system we have now? What do you think would happen?
I'll answer mine quickly and turn it over.
We'll do this very quickly and then have everyone ask one question. This was very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, we could change the date of the election. The question is, what's the best improvement on it? Is it, as some people have suggested, putting the date in the middle of the week and making it a holiday? Is it putting it on one day of the weekend or 2 days of the weekend? There are a variety of examples around the world where people do it in different manners, but we're not sure whether it's the cultural difference that gives them the higher voting rate, or is it the fact that they do it on a Sunday? But yes, we could change the date if we were sure we had a better date.
Madam Secretary?
I believe there are 11 states that have early voting. I'm not familiar with the law in each state, but in Arkansas, you can vote early 15 days prior to any election. And that means you can go to the county courthouse and vote, or there is one county here that has off-site voting. I think Texas has several off-site early voting places throughout their counties. Also, with absentee voting, there's been a great move to try to make absentee voting easier with a no excuse. Arkansas's answer to no excuse absentee was early voting. So currently in Arkansas, we still need to have an excuse to vote absentee. But I see as time is going on that these things are changing. People want to vote at their convenience. And I think government, as a rule, is going to have to start looking at the way we do business and determine when we can be available that will be the most help to the people that we serve. And I think that would be a huge cultural and institutional change for government, but I think it's one that needs to happen and needs to happen as soon as we can make this type of institutional change.
Mr. Lewis, quickly on digital signatures and rolls.
If I remember correctly, I believe there are now 9 states that have a statewide voter database. Actually, probably the 2 states that have done the very best job are those that combined in their law that the driver's license and the voter registration card are identical, and that they have married those so that whatever information DMV has, the elections office has. So that there is no separation of those, so that DMV cannot say that we didn't pass you the information. You have a terminal in your office that shows you have the information in the same one. But that would require most of the states readopting their NVRA compliance laws to where they make it a single application and single database. And that is probably a good idea, so that when you change your address for driver's license purposes, it automatically changes the voter registration address. And conversely, if you come into a voter registration office, then you update it and it automatically changes DMV records. That is probably a good idea that we're going to have to look at for most of the states, because then the citizens who were disenfranchised by the fact that they said they went to DMV and registered, but then the election official had no record of that, would solve that problem. In terms of digital signatures, I know that we've all heard lots about this at this point. And I will say to you that we're having to look at and deal with people who know far more about the internet than I do. I own a computer business for 10 years, and that just makes me dangerous when we're talking about some of this. I know just enough to get us all in trouble. But I will say this. I respect those people who understand the workings of the internet far better than I. And they are telling us right now it has inherent weaknesses that even a digital signature cannot resolve in terms of doing it from home or office, okay? That doesn't mean that we can't do a form of internet voting. And I think certainly the companies that we have looked at and the tests that we have looked at so far indicate that controlled access from a polling place, a polling site, certainly is our entry level into this. And I think we're going to begin to see that grow fairly rapidly. And so there, I'll leave it at that.
Do you want to comment?
Yes. Edie, in the countries in which IFAS has worked, generally the voting turnouts are between 70 and 90%. I personally have witnessed people who have traveled more than 2 days just in order to be able to vote in Nepal. And it is disturbing here in the U.S. that in 1960, 63% of the electorate participated, and in this last election, it was just barely 50.1%. So if anything, I hope we do use this as an election as an opportunity to awaken our people in terms of the importance of participating. As far as the numbers of people participating and whether the system could handle it, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that anybody could really give you that answer today. But I think the problem on this election was not the turnouts, it was the election was so close. And every country I've been in, election administrators pray for big turnouts and wide margins. And so whenever you have a situation like in New Mexico at one point, you could have gotten the difference between Bush and Gore into a Volkswagen. I mean, 4 votes at one point was what separated them. And when you start looking at an election of this close of a nature, what it says is that we do have to concentrate on what the Institute of Politics is trying to do, enhancing and beefing up our election administration to give the tools, because election administration is the key to creating a system that people can trust and believe in the results.
I want to make sure we get to as many people. This is for you, so let's move through very quickly on questions and answers. We'll be brief, you be brief. Next, please.
Yeah, I have a question about possibilities for legislative change. It seems to me that we could probably mostly agree that the purpose of voting is to get as wide a number of people to, as closely as possible, translate one intended vote to one actual vote. And it seems to me that there's 3 components, and I'd like to hear your comments on the possibilities of each of these 3 components actually being legislatively changed. The first component is that voting be extended to a wide as net as possible, and here I'm thinking about 1, laws that restrict, for instance, convicted felons in certain states. Also laws, I know Oregon had a mail-in ballot, and they had something like 83% voting in the state of Oregon. So what about the possibilities for that? The second level would be that one person uniformly across, no matter where they were comes as nearly as possible to one intended vote to one actual vote within the state. And I think that laws that could address those issues potentially would be laws having to do with getting rid of making standardizations across the country about what types of voting machinery and what types of standards are used for counting votes. And then the last issue is taking the states' votes and weighting them equally across states. I think that, in my personal opinion, that would necessitate getting rid of the electoral college system for voting for presidents. It is possible for a president to win with 26% of the popular vote, and another candidate to have 74% of the of the vote. That seems to me, and certain small states like Montana are much more heavily weighted than other states, about a 3-to-1 margin like New York or California. So what do you think are the possibilities of such
I'll take just the electoral college component of this. Perhaps an outdated system, but very difficult to change because it's part of the Constitution. I think it would only take 13 states to say no, we're not so interested. Yet 34 of the 50 states actually benefit from the electoral college over-representation of them being smaller states. It's not going to happen. It's very unlikely to happen. It's very hard to change the Constitution as it ought to be. Trevor, very briefly on national legislation or some kind of standard ballot?
I think you're unlikely to see a standard nationwide ballot because that would mean you'd have to separate the election for president from the whole rest of the ballot. And it's interesting that we do a lot more voting than most countries do. If you look at Europe or Canada, which just had its election, it's only got one question on the ballot. Who is your local representative going to be? But I think, practically speaking, the states are not going to want to separate the federal election from the rest of it. One thing I'd add to your comment about the Electoral College is that actually the states, if they wanted to, could make some significant changes already. They could move to apportioning their electoral votes based on congressional district. I don't know that they're going to want to do it, but you don't have to have a constitutional amendment to make that sort of a change, which could make a real difference.
State your name and ask a question.
Reg McKean of the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. And my question comes out of the listening I did to the, yesterday, as many of us did, to these tapes about the Supreme Court questioning. When I heard Republicans speak, I got the impression that any ballot that was problematic because the voter made some didn't follow directions. When I heard Democrats speak, I got the idea that any problematic ballot was caused by machine error or by some other factor beyond the control of the individual voter. So I'm trying to sort this out in my own mind. I would appreciate help. I wonder, particularly from Trevor, but anyone on the panel, do we have any statistics that would help me know to what extent are problematic ballots or problematic machine ballots, let's narrow it down, more likely to be the fault of the machine or some element beyond the voter's control?
Well, I'd like Secretary Priest to actually address this with respect to the counties and the varying systems that you have in Arkansas. But again, part of it comes back to the notion of what is a vote. And if there's a fuzzy definition of a vote, then it's hard to pin down whether it's the voter's fault or it's actually the machine's fault. Tell us about the variance and how you account for voter error as opposed to machine error among your counties in Arkansas, please.
Well, we're fortunate that we have 49 counties on an OptiScan system, and that makes it a whole lot easier. We only have 7 counties that use punch cards. But I think the difference is that we of course approve equipment through the State Board of Election Commissioners in Arkansas, and we also have some standardized recount procedures. If you want to recount, first of all, the candidate has to pay for it, and secondly, the the recount will be counted the same way the vote was counted the first time. Only if the election commission, the county election commission, feels that there's a problem with the machinery, will they go for a hand count. A hand count is not something that a candidate can demand.
In Arkansas.
That's right.
In
These
Arkansas, right.
That's the complexity, is that we have not just 50 systems, but many more than 50 systems when you look at the county level.
But Professor King.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
I would say, I mean, states do have the ability through state law to do some standardization, as we've done on absentee voting or on early voting or on recounts. And I think that using best practices that we have throughout the country, I think we have the answers if we'll just look at that and remember that I think a whole lot of these problems can be resolved by not only dealing with law and what counts as a vote, but also dealing with training people. And I think training people who are involved in the elections process is a very important part of this.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Ron Newman, and I'm a sometimes member of Computer Professional for Social Responsibility, which has been concerned about the subject of integrity of elections and computer technology for many years, unfortunately, basically under the radar screen. My real concern that I haven't heard anybody talk about here yet is how do you ensure the integrity of computer programs that are used to tabulate votes, whether it's punch cards, touch screens, OptiScans, whatever the method is. My understanding is that most of these computer programs are owned by private companies that are unwilling to share the source code of these programs with the state election authorities, which means the state election authorities are basically placing an enormous amount of trust in companies without any accountability.
Not so.
Yes, it tells about how the standards are set, and the decision to actually buy certain machines is based on extensive testing that's done.
The federal government published in 1990 federal voting system standards, and we have been trying to get Congress to authorize money so that we can continue to update those and make those dynamic rather than static, meaning that we update them on a regular basis. But for a system to be sold in 32 states, it has to go through national qualification testing at independent test authorities. In addition to escrowing the software and the source code at our independent test authorities, who are indeed going through to make sure that the software cannot be easily manipulated, that it does not indeed allow for Trojan horses, that it cannot be manipulated by casual folks. So that testing is done, and those standards are developed to do that. Then each of the states that approves a voting system, there are a handful who make no requirements at all for their state, only a handful. All the rest require escrowing of that source code and a copy of the actual software with the state. And so that could be used to compare what's in that system if a court decision were held that says, let's examine that. And so it's there for testing. So certainly, and then add to it, because American elections are so diffused, you would have to manipulate not one machine, but lots of machines. And you would have to manipulate enough of them that you could indeed affect the outcome of an election, which would mean that you would have to have the collusion of the vendor and of great many elections officials within each jurisdiction in order to do this. And so, indeed, the sky may be falling, but it doesn't seem that Chicken Little really, in this case, has to worry about it a great deal.
Professor.
Louis Branscombe, I'm a member of the faculty, former director of the National Bureau of Standards, in fact, among other things. I don't share the panel's optimism. You talked about how the system is working, about how people now understand that every vote counts. For every young person that now believes that every vote that gets counted counts, There's another one who believes that maybe they didn't get to vote because they're a minority. Over 70% of the minorities in Florida voted. In many cases, the lines were too long and they were shut off before they got in. In other cases, there were other obstacles placed. But there's just as many people who worry about whether their vote really does get counted, I believe, as there are who understand that in small margins it makes a difference if you try to vote. And I worry that the criterion we're using for judging that our system is working is the absence of voter complaints loud enough to reach the newspapers and make a furor and cause a political problem. And I'd just like to make an observation and ask a question. The observation is, first we should realize that there are huge pressures for intentional biases in the voting system. This is not a system in which everybody involved is idealistic or in which there are equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans at every stage in the process. And I would cite you the one thing I usefully learned from David King when this group met 3 weeks ago in this same place to talk about the election, right after the election. And that's the fact that in Florida, there's a law that nobody has mentioned on television in which the winner of the previous gubernatorial election determines the party whose presidential candidate gets listed first. And in an election where the candidates are not well known, the professors tell me, the experts tell me, that's worth 1% to 2% of the vote. Well, here the candidates are well known, so the percentage would be smaller, except maybe they're equally well known, so maybe it's bigger again. If 0.1% bias is introduced from that source, it's more than enough to change the winner. So the system has to be robust. It has to be robust against the fact that there are all kinds of manipulations going on. By the way, it may well be a Democratic legislature that passed that law. I don't know. So my question is this, and it bothers me a lot. We talk about the technology and we talk about all of the procedures and training that surrounds it. Well, of course, I'm embarrassed by the discussion that goes on CNN and elsewhere about the election technology. It's as though this country didn't send a man to the moon, as though we don't know how to manufacture computers, as though we don't understand that every mechanical or electrical device has limiting levels of error that includes the human dimension. And so if indeed we test these machines under realistic conditions, understanding how real people interact with them, and we understand what the residual levels of error are, then we surely should have in our rules a provision that says if you do the election and you do the count and the margin of victory is smaller than the known error rate of the equipment, then you do one of two things. You either have a hand ballot count of everybody in the state, or you do what they do in New Mexico when there's a tie. You play a hand of poker or flip a coin, because this election was a tie. I guarantee you it was a tie. The technology in Florida does not allow you to tell who won, and yet the rules don't accommodate that reality. And I think a lot of Americans are desperately confused over it. Now, is there a way to deal with that?
I think this is one of the dangers of having a panel full of people who are close to the system, because we understand to an extent how comfortable and how complicated it is. We're comfortable with the issues and understand how complicated it is. I think that there is a crisis out there, and I think it's especially acute for young Americans. Americans learn about the presidency from the election that's closest to their 10th birthday. I have a 10-year-old, and what is she learning about this election? She's learning that there's just a terrible sense of disarray, and they don't know whether their votes count or not. I think that the passion that you have is the passion that many Americans have, and that's why this will be dealt with, and Congress will be involved. And to the extent that technocrats retreat behind a barrier saying, well, don't worry about it, we can solve this problem, they'll be bruised in the political battle to come. Thank you. Next question.
My name is Mike Weisman. I work here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to put forth a specific possibility and then hear your comment on why it might or might not happen. Suppose early in the next congressional session, Congress gets its act together and says we need to do something about exactly the differing standards that we've all been talking about. And they call for the creation of some sort of blue ribbon commission under the aegis of the NIST or the NSF or some similarly appropriate federal agency of experts in, say, constitutional law, human interface, human cognition, that sort of thing, to come up with some appropriate standards, not necessarily mandating one uniform ballot, but some appropriate standards. And they appropriate sufficient money to put it all into effect by 2002, the next federal elections, thereby demonstrating to the American public that they have not missed the seriousness of this, or failing that certainly by 2004, next presidential election. We've talked about $6 or $8 billion, even if it's 20. I don't think that is at all an inappropriate investment to make in democracy, especially when we spend 10 times that on things like defense, which some people would question. I don't know that many people would question investment in democracy itself. So I wonder if you think things could come about that quickly or not.
Well, Congress is going to act. This is where the action is, and members of Congress like to be where there's an argument and where there will be cameras. And there are a lot of arguments and a lot of cameras focused on this right now. I don't know whether they will actually move to implement the recommendations of a blue ribbon commission, but you can count on blue ribbon commissions in various states and from various national associations. I want to have two final questions, one over here and then the final question there, and then give all of our panelists a moment to make closing comments. So we will just end with two questions. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Virginia Wadsworth, I'm a Cambridge resident and member of the older group, and I care about my grandchildren being raised in a country that is as exciting as this democracy is. And you mentioned maybe some foreigners are laughing at us. I think most of them are envious of what we're going through. It's a very exciting procedure. And I think they realize that democracy is the best plan around. Why else would we have so many people coming to our shores? But I do have a question. I was worried, number one, about the speed that one candidate and his group wanted everything to stop, which I think is totally unfair, and I think that would confuse the young. And I think from 10 years on, you have to start educating people so that they will vote. I can't imagine not voting. Otherwise, why are you a member of the country? And the next question really is, why can't we be as simple as Canada and use a pencil and count it that quickly? Is there any reason why we can't, or did I hear a reason why we couldn't?
I want to turn to Donald Ty in just a moment to talk about young voters and how we can continue to engage them. Canada is a country with 31 million people. California is a state with 32 million people. They have one national election. They don't have a lot of little local elections, even for judges, much less for city council members and for very few elections. And so it's much easier for them to have one national ballot. There's very little innovation happening in Canada. One of the beautiful things about our system with decentralization is there's a tremendous amount of innovation that is happening at the local level. There have been internet voting attempts, optical scanners, a local innovative attempt, and very low levels of error rates because of the innovation at the local level. So I think moving towards a Canadian system would be a mistake, unworkable in the U.S. given the number of elections that we have. Donald Ty, how do we get young people to vote? In about 30 seconds, can you answer that for me?
Yes. If I could ask everyone in the room to raise your hand if you voted, if you were eligible to vote and voted just now, November 7th. And out of everyone with their hand up, how many people's parents voted when they were growing up? If we have a 50% turnout of voters in America, of eligible voters, roughly, plus or minus, let's say half of all American children are growing up in a home with no voting parent. And so if you're not getting it at home and you're not getting it at school, then as you say, just as surely as voting is a habit, so is not voting. So I do feel strongly that making sure that it's in the schools is a strong curriculum. The fact is, kids interface with their world through technology now. To whatever degree technology becomes increasingly part of our voting or not, it's got to be part of their education process, how they learn about candidates, issues, and even the opportunity to vote. And it's just a matter of you get that habit in front of them or you don't.
Final question and then closing comments from all the panelists, about 1 minute long.
Seth Borenstein, I live in Washington, D.C. For Secretary Priest, what specific things do you want to see in a federal law to improve the election system, and what don't you want to see?
Well, I don't want to see a federal mandate of equipment. In fact, I think that's a slippery slope. If you want to do a standardized ballot, there's a problem. The only way you can have a standardized ballot, I believe, is through standardized equipment. And if you have standardized equipment, then you're creating virtually a monopoly for somebody. So I have a problem with that. I would like to see an opportunity for Congress and for states and locals to work together to find solutions. There are some things in terms of NVRA that need cleanup. There are some things that we must address in terms of ADA, American with Disabilities Act. And I think this gives us an opportunity to pull it all together, taking some time to look at it, look at what's out there. And if we don't have one system throughout the country, we surely can have one system in every state. And I believe that 5 states are already there, and many states are probably like Arkansas, where we have almost 2/3 of our counties on a similar system. So in terms of the federal law, let's don't jump into something right away. If the federal government wants to help states and counties look at options and help us finance those options, that would be very welcome. But I think there's danger in moving too quickly.
Thank you very much. We turn now to closing comments with about a minute or a little more, but try and keep it to a minute. And I'd like you, we'll go in reverse order from which we started. So Mr. Sudriette, you'd be first. But I'd like you to try and tell us something we haven't heard tonight, something that everyone should know but we haven't come across in our conversation, something that might be surprising, either encouraging or discouraging, but tell us something we don't know.
David asked me to bring up some examples, and the United States is really the major country in the world that started using voting equipment. But it's fascinating, over the past 5 years, Brazil, which is a large country that is, it's the largest country in the world after the United States that has successfully implemented the use of electronic voting equipment. They've used it now in 2 national elections, and it's gone very well. And so I think it's an example of how technology can be adapted. But they did it through a very careful, reasoned process. They didn't do it throughout the whole country overnight. It took a several-year period. They phased it in, and they developed it in such a way that it was a voter-friendly process. And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind here, is that at the end of the day, in order to get people to participate, our voting systems have got to be friendly and voter-friendly, and they also have to give the opportunity to make sure, as our questioner raised before, that every vote does count. We're confident that the United States will get through this. And again, I think that by the concentration on the importance of election administration, this is an area that has been far too much on the back burner in the past. It's been a stepchild of the field of public administration, and I think we need to put more emphasis on training of officials at all levels here in the United States, and we're very confident that this hopefully will happen and we will be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tai?
To pick up on a couple of the points that were raised tonight in the context of technology, I will just say that I think we need to be open to the incrementalism, incremental rollout and incorporation of technology into voting. And certainly on the internet side, and the question that was raised about software, there are companies out there now that have fully confirmable and even through the internet fully auditable processes where they can confirm every vote that was cast. They can confirm that that data was never accessed again, and then that, in fact, while unknown of its content, that it went into the counting process. Election.com is a company that donated pro bono the services for Youth eVote. They had also done the Arizona Democratic primary in March 2000. VoteHere.net just worked through with secretaries of state and did pilot internet voting in Sacramento and San Diego County in California and in Maricopa County in Arizona. And on the websites is demonstrations of what worked and the integrity of the data. There's concerns in the context of privacy and security and integrity, initially perhaps addressed by some of the just having on-site polling, and the technology is going to come around. Trevor mentioned the Department of Defense pilot project they did now. The internet's based on some of the commitment for communications that the Department of Defense formed. There's going to be a lot of people leading the way, and as Secretary Priest has said, it's going to work first for some precincts in some areas and maybe later for others that it's appropriate. And so I think it's wrong to be afraid or to shut down being open to what will work and where first.
Trevor Potter.
I think the thing we haven't talked about tonight is acknowledging that there is a real constituency out there for doing nothing, for leaving it alone. And I refer to that in the whole broad range of this. The fact that the voter turnout is low, the fact that it is difficult to register, that same-day registration only occurs in a few states and is I think, seen as very threatening to others. All the issues of can we find some way through modern technology to bring in younger voters who are very comfortable with technology and very uncomfortable with going to a voting place and walking in and looking at a battery of people they don't know and voting in that setting. I think what we need to acknowledge is that when we had Motor Voter coming through Congress, there were a lot of people who were very uncomfortable with the notion that this was going to change the system. Change is in many ways seen as a threat to people, and I think we do have to acknowledge that we have some real problems in terms of the level of participation we have, the comfort with younger people voting, the ease of understanding a ballot, plus the technological aspects of the actual machinery and counting, and that we're just going to have to push, given that there are a lot of barriers in the system to making any change at all.
I just want to welcome one more person who is joining us and will be available to speak with everyone here in the forum afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Ernie Hawkins. Welcome. He has come a long way through multiple airports and many snowstorms to join us. This is the Registrar of Voters in Sacramento County in California, and he's the nerve center of information in America for how county election officials view the system. I think we'll have you have the second to last word in just a moment and then make you available to everyone in the audience afterward as well. Mr. Lewis.
I want to choose what I say carefully here. I know that most of us are looking at this system probably somewhat like a mosquito in a nudist colony. You know, we're not sure where to begin on the process of reforming what's there. And yet at the same time, and I understand and I hear people who say, gee, we don't want you to get too defensive about this and defend the system. But the system works, folks. It has flaws. It is imperfect. It will be imperfect after we make revisions to it. I am not one of those who's afraid of change because I believe, honestly, as a democracy, we evolve and things come about that force you to change in some instances. And certainly, we're going to have to look at some parts of this process and make those changes and make them willingly and openly and correctly. But like Secretary Priest, I think we ought to do that carefully and with a great deal of thought. This is far more complex than it appears. And simple solutions are very often very neat, very plausible, and most often wrong. And so what I would hope we do is that we look at this over a period of time and pick those things that indeed need improvement and should and can change. And certainly it looks to me that we're going to have to look at some issues that heretofore we didn't even look at as elections administrators. Certainly the qualification of voters to anticipate and know how to use voting systems. Certainly the foibles that have come about as we've learned as people who were disenfranchised because somehow their voter registration and their appearance at the polls didn't match. We've got to fix that. Certainly, I don't want to be one of those who defends the punch card system, but there are elections administrators who have had no problems with it, and their procedures are different. And so they don't see a reason to move from that. And I don't want to defend it because I don't really care one way or the other. I think we do need to make sure that any voting system is voter friendly, and we need to look at that.
Thank you very much. Madam Secretary?
Well, you wanted to talk about something that hasn't been talked about. Let me just say that there are probably as many, if not more, groups talking about how to engage citizens in our democracy. If our citizens want to be engaged, this is probably a very good issue for them to get involved in. For example, I think the gentleman named Louis Branscombe, I believe, was saying, talking about people not being, or he not being as optimistic as others. I will tell you, I am optimistic. But out there in the real world, in places like Arkansas and Iowa and Montana and those places, they have to make some very difficult decisions when it comes to budgeting. Are we going to spend money for a road grader or fire equipment or police equipment, or are we going to spend our money on election equipment? Usually when they look at the cost to benefit ratio, they say we are going to get much more out of a road grader. And it's very hard to explain to a citizen that, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do anything to your road, we can't throw gravel, we can't grade it because we bought election equipment this time. It's a matter of priorities, and citizens need to come forward and say, this is a priority for us, this is democracy. And I have full faith and confidence in all of us as Americans that we can work together and come up with solutions. Will we ever be perfect? No. But democracy is not perfect, and that's what makes our democracy so special, and I'm so proud to be a part of it.
Thank you very much. Ernie Hawkins.
You want me to do the presentation?
No, we're just going to have to summarize.
Okay. I'm often asked to describe the election.
Into the mic.
I'm often asked to describe the election process, and it's actually very simple. Candidates come in and tell us they want to be on the ballot. People bring measures in for us to put on the ballot. We gather this stuff all up, print it, send it out to the polls. The voters come in and vote. We gather it up, count it, report the results. Pretty simple. As we've all learned in the last month, it is not that simple. And there's a lot of flaws in the system, but I don't know a system that exists out there in our everyday lives that's perfect. Think of it. The medical system's not perfect. They amputate people's legs when they went in to go for a tonsillectomy. They send the wrong babies home from the hospital. Our legal system's not perfect. People go to jail for crimes they didn't commit. People are even executed occasionally. Newspapers aren't perfect. The airlines aren't perfect, as I can testify from my flight here today. They bumped me off of a flight from Boston to Boston because of weather, and then routed me to Denver where it was snowing. The interesting thing, I think, about election administration, it's been described as a real hodgepodge process, and I suppose it is, when you consider that there are 10,000 local jurisdictions in the country, 192,142 polling locations in the last election. We had over 1 million poll workers working on election day, and we had 1.5 million elections officials of various shapes and description, including poll workers. And when you put all of those systems, we put all those people into the process, it's not going to be perfect. It never will be perfect. And as hard as we try to make it perfect, it will not be. In my jurisdiction, we have 611,000 registered voters. In the last election, we had about 400,000 people voting. The cost to Sacramento County for conducting that election was $2.5 million. If I extrapolate that data nationwide, it comes out to be about $300 million for every election that we conduct. The cost of democracy is not cheap. We're estimating in California alone to replace our voting equipment cost about $400 million. A state-of-the-art equipment that provides an audit trail with a touch screen in my jurisdiction alone is $96 million. That's a lot of money to spend for elections that you conduct once every 4 years when you're talking about the president. We conduct elections in California. In this last election, for example, we drew a random alphabet, and then rotated the candidates so each of the candidates had an opportunity to be in the number one position. After each election, we manually recount 1% of the precincts. I use a punch card system, 30-year-old punch card system. During my 20-year tenure, I've probably conducted 100 elections using that system. The manual recounts have never changed the results of an election. And in some instances, we have had 1 or 2 votes change, but that's rare. The presidential election that was just conducted, the punch card vote count, automated count, and the manual recount were identical. I bring this up only to tell you that the systems can work if they're executed and used properly. Every voting system that is approved for use in the United States is designed to work perfectly in a laboratory setting, and they do. But when you mix all of the things that I've just mentioned in, you can't expect a perfect process. I think, as several people have mentioned, we have funding issues at every level. At the local level, we compete with child welfare, we compete with law and justice, we compete with potholes. And when it's not election time and you try to get in line to get some of the available resources, elections don't seem to be very high priority unless you've had a disaster. We've probably had a disaster. And I think we'll see a lot of money being thrown at this problem. I'm hoping that we do it with care and that we don't throw the whole process out while we're trying to reform.
Thank you very much. In my closing comments, I want to thank everyone for being a part of this panel. Thank you very much for being here as well, and thank you for the people who are joining us on the internet. The thing that disturbs me most about our election is not the intent of the voters, but the intent of the non-voters. Elderly Americans vote at a very high rate. My generation votes at a quite low rate. And young people in America, the young voters, are only 1/3 of eligible voters are turning out. I think that's the real national crisis. We have barriers to voting through the educational process, where they're not learning about civics, through the registration process, where in many jurisdictions it's very difficult. Let's not let those barriers get in the way for my children to vote. Let's teach them that voting is important, that participation in a civic community and a civic family is important. I think it's a disgrace that only 1/3 of young people are turning out to vote. The older voters won't be around. Many of them won't be around 10 years from now. And we need to worry about that next generation of voters while we're worrying about the next generation of voting machines. Thank you again to the Institute of Politics, to Kathy McLaughlin, to Larry Harris, who has helped to put this together. Thank you very much to Senator Pryor, and again to everyone here on the panel. Good night.